So I've recently finished reading James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl to my kids at night as a bedtime story. And so I thought I'd give a quick review so that you, if you are thinking of doing the same, know what to expect. It's funny how often you forget interesting details, perhaps details you wouldn't have noticed because you were a child. Now, as an adult, you pick up on it. So I don't want to analyze a book to death, but just thought I'd give a couple of positive and negative aspects to this book, and then you can decide whether you want to read it. So there's a romantic nostalgia that I think we all have with Roald Dahl books, thinking back to our childhood, whether you read it in an English class or whether your parents read it to you. These stories are well known and loved. Um, Basically, what happens is James is an orphan and lives with two horrible aunts, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and he's pretty miserable. But some hope gets injected into the story at some point where an old strange man offers him some magic green beans, which he's supposed to drink. He doesn't get to drink it because he trips over a root of a peach tree, and those beans burrow into the ground and escape him. So it looks like all hope is lost. Um, but instead, what happens is those beans affect the peach tree. That giant peach grows, and it's all about James's adventures with the other insects that are on this peach as they roll down the hill, end up in the ocean, and then cross the Atlantic finally to land on the spire of the Empire State Building. So, fantastic type of a story. It's not good to overanalyze these things, but I thought I'd just share my thoughts after having read it. So, some positive aspects. There's memorable characters in this book. Um, James Henry Trotter is a name that kids like to say. We think of the centipede, and he has some interesting quirks, like a centipede with all his legs. He always wants to put his boots on and off. As you can imagine, that's quite a comical situation every time it happens. There's a grasshopper, there's a silkworm, a glowworm, a spider. I'm sure I'm leaving someone out here, an earthworm. So some memorable characters that kids can identify with. Um, and then there's some memorable characters who are negative, like on Sponge and on Spiker, but that alliteration is great, and it really does describe what they looked like. There's some really good aspects of poetry in the book, which, whether you like poetry or not, it is something that is part of our language development, and our imagination, stimulates the imagination. So it's a good introduction to poetry for kids. It makes it something fun. There's definitely a redemptive aspect to this book. You just think of James, he's miserable, he's in a terrible situation, which we can all identify with, because the Bible tells us that the world is broken, the world is fallen, the world is not the way that God made it, and so there's always this longing in us for to be rescued, for something better, and so we see that coming out here. It's a good opportunity to start introducing gospel themes to the kids. There's educational points. You think of the centipede. Although he's called a centipede, he doesn't actually have 100 feet. He has 42. I don't know how accurate that is, but I think they don't have 100 feet. We learn about where the ears on a grasshopper are. So things like that is good for young children to learn. And then we see a hero that they can aspire to. James is the hero, but he's not a hero because he has superpowers. He's a hero because he just applies level-headed thinking to a situation, and through that level-headed thinking and common sense, he is able to save the day. And so that's a good thing, because that's something that kids can actually learn to do. So the story stimulates the imagination, and with a little bit of editing, it's very clean and wholesome. And when I say a little bit of editing, I'm just talking about some of the language that I personally don't want my kids to be using at this point. It's not terrible, but for example, on page 21, on Spiker says, "Get away from that tree trunk, you stupid boy." Okay, I don't want my kids saying that at this point, so I tend to edit that a little bit as I read it. One of the characters says, "Let go, you idiot." Okay, on page 56. So that sort of thing, I tend to just change a little bit, because I don't want my kids picking up on those things which they inevitably do pick up on. There are positive aspects to language. There's some words that Roald Dahl invents, which really just are very descriptive. Right at the end, where the police find them on the top of the Empire State Building, they're trying to figure out what these things are, and they're guessing. It's a wampus, it's a gorgon, it's a sea serpent, it's a proc, it's a manticore. I mean, those words are nonsense, but it's really helpful in terms of stimulating language. So language, positive and negative. Some other negative characteristics. There's a bit of a bunny hugging message, which of course we don't want to overanalyze these things, but on the spider in the book basically lamenting the fact that people are always out to kill them, and how her aunt got stuck in paint, and it bothers me a little bit, but it probably shouldn't. You can draw your own conclusions there, because the fact is we are called to take dominion. We're here to rule over our world, and if a spider's living in my house, it's not going to be living very long. There's an orphan aspect to it which I didn't think comes across well. Just having adopted kids myself, James's parents are killed when he's very young, as they're shopping, by a rhinoceros which has escaped from the London Zoo. It's fun, but having adopted kids, that's not quite the way I would like them to be thinking about their biological parents, and so I just find that things like that can be negative. And it's worth thinking through, even if you don't have adopted kids, just in terms of how do your kids grow up understanding adoption. Another thing related to that is that James came from this wonderful situation with his parents where they were just the best. He just had lots of fun, they did great things with him. And then his adoptive parents are these terrible tyrants. And that too, it happens, but it's also not the picture of adoption that I'd like my kids to grow up with. And so there's things like that which might be worth thinking through. There's this part toward the end about cloud men, which is rather silly. In my opinion, you may love it, but I thought that it would probably be a better book without that whole section in it. So really, that's it. Those are some positive and negative thoughts that I had. It really does stimulate the imagination. So overall, I would recommend it as a book to read to your kids. My kids are 5, 3, and 1. And I found they all managed to get something from it. Obviously, the 5-year-olds got the most, but it's always good to just question them on the story from last night. And it's amazing how much they end up understanding and retaining. Just on that, there are a lot of words which we don't use anymore. Words like lavatory. And I just personally think it's helpful to actually read that word as it's written and then explain it, rather than simplifying the language for the sake of their understanding. It just helps them to actually grow and develop. So yeah, those were my thoughts. I would recommend it, but be thinking through the worldview that you're giving your kids, and perhaps you might, like me, want to just edit a few things lightly here and there. Agree, disagree, let me know what you think.